Welcome to Algeria, lying on the southern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. It's the largest country in the continent, a land of rich history, ancient civilizations, and spectacular scenery. Ranging from rugged mountains, lakes and forests, fertile valleys ripe with olive groves, tropical fruits and date palms. And in the south, Algeria boasts the largest desert in the world, the Sahara, home of the nomadic Tuareg. This is a proud nation with a diverse population, made up of Berber tribes and their unique customs and traditions. Born after a war with France in the early 60s, Algeria's rise, fueled by oil riches, has been a long and tempestuous one. It's a relatively new country, but that also makes it an undiscovered gem in the world of travel. In this series, we engage with guides and experts as we explore hidden Algeria. Algeria is located on the North African coast along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, in a region commonly known as the Maghreb, bordered by Morocco on the west, Mauritania and Mali on the southwest, Niger to the southeast, and Tunisia and Libya to the east. In this episode, we explore the undiscovered cities and ruins of its historic hinterland. The Mediterranean Sea, highway of the Phoenicians and Romans from 800 BC to the 4th century AD. They used the North African coast as a staging post for their expansive trade. Not surprising then that Algeria's first cities sprang up as ports along its gorgeous coastline. Our Algerian coastal tour starts in ancient Tipaza, en route to Spanish-influenced Oran. Leaving Oran, we drive to the agricultural foothills of the Shelif Valley, to Tlemcen, Algeria's ancient royal capital. We head east into the Ores Mountains, the land of the Kabyle and the settlement of Timgad. We end our journey back on the coast in the Numidian capital of Sirte, modern-day Constantine. The coastal hills surrounding Mount Chinua are lush, a region ripe with vineyards. In the mountain's shadow lies Tipaza, an ancient Phoenician harbour that grew into a Roman colony under Claudius in 43 BC. Among the ruins, you can still find the remains of theatres, villas, and Christian basilicas. It was here in the 3rd century that Christianity entered Africa. The Romans took over 100 years and 3 Punic wars against Carthage to establish their concept of civilization along this stretch of the Maghreb.
Rome originally was involved in a major power struggle with Carthage, situated in modern Tunisia, in the late Roman Republic. This was a struggle to the death between the growing Roman Republic and Carthage. There were 3 major wars. The last one resulted in the defeat and the sacking of Carthage in 146 BC. Afterwards, then, there was an impetus for Roman colonisation of North Africa. And the Romans occupied the old Punic part of North Africa and gradually started to move westwards into Numidia or eastern Algeria, and then right across through to Morocco. That process was a gradual and careful one because there was a pre-existing kingdom in this area, a Numidian kingdom with significant architecture.
The most impressive example is this striking royal tomb that erupts from the ground like a giant molehill just a few minutes' drive from Tipaza. The site is a magnet for tourists. This royal mausoleum of Mauritanian kings is the resting place of the Numidian ruler Juba II and his wife Selene. Selene was the product of that most passionate love affair between Cleopatra and Mark Antony. To the casual observer, the tomb looks like a pyramid placed on top of a Greek or Roman Colosseum.
What you see in Numidian architecture and Numidian funerary architecture is a fusion of ideas from throughout the Mediterranean. We see Greek, Hellenistic, Egyptian, as well as local inspiration. This is not some simple copying of bits and pieces, but an integrated view of architecture and art that is specifically North African. And so you see in those royal tombs elements of architecture that have been adapted from elsewhere throughout the Mediterranean world, but fused together in a form that is specifically and uniquely Numidian and North African.
The Ottomans, who ruled Algeria in the 16th century, called this royal resting place the Tomb of the Christian, as there's a cross panel that adorns its entrance. They ordered its destruction, but when their workmen were killed by a swarm of bees, the mausoleum was thought to be cursed. And so here it still stands, a playground for families on their weekend outings. Our first stop from Tipaza is Oran. To get there, it's a 4-hour car drive along the A1 highway. Oran, pronounced Oran, is Algeria's closest point to Europe. It's always flourished as a busy port, and it still services cargo ships and ferries making regular runs to Casablanca and Marseille. In the 19th century, it was a favourite destination for hundreds and thousands of French immigrants fleeing poverty in France and settling here. Over the course of the next 100 years, the descendants of these migrants became known as Pieds Noirs. Although born in Algeria, they felt French, and over time became the rulers of Algeria. The French influence in Oran remains to this day. Oran's architecture also reflects its multicultural past. For Oran has an historic Spanish influence too. A bull ring still dominates Oran's old Spanish neighbourhood. Among the first settlers here were Andalusian merchants, who plied their trade as far back as the 9th century. Today, Oran prides itself as a holiday destination, with tourist hotels fronting sandy beaches. They run along a 1-mile coastal stretch of resorts called Les Andalous. Among the few foreign visitors here are some descendants of Pieds Noirs.
Alors, je viens de Paris. Je suis venue en Algérie parce que je voulais connaître l'Algérie depuis longtemps, notamment parce que j'ai des origines pieds noirs et que je voulais en connaître un peu plus sur là où avaient grandi mes grands-parents. Voilà. C'est le voyage de mes 30 ans, donc je voulais faire un voyage qui a du sens. Et le fait de voyager en Algérie, qui est en train de se libérer, etc., ça avait beaucoup de sens pour nous de le faire, puisque chacune a une attache différente avec l'Algérie. Donc c'est important pour nous de le faire, ce voyage. Voilà.
We found a local guide, Zaki, to show us around and give us a few insider tips on the city.
Salam alaikum, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Zaki, j'ai 28 ans, je travaille dans la publicité et j'habite à Oran. Ici, vous êtes chez moi. Je me lève tous les matins en regardant la montagne Marjajou et tout le centre-ville. La mer. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous montrer mon Oran. Let's go. Quelle belle journée. De toute façon, à Oran, il fait toujours beau.
Oran has a multicultural and cosmopolitan feel, and that's because it has always been a colonial city. Spanish and French settlers especially put their stamp on the streets and buildings. One Frenchman who was born in these streets grew up to become one of the greatest fashion designers of the 20th century.
Vous connaissez cette maison? Non? Elle est plutôt par là, vous aurez une meilleure vue. Et là, vous l'avez reconnu? Toujours pas. Et pourtant, l'un des plus grands créateurs de mode est né ici. Vous connaissez Yves Saint Laurent? Eh oui, Yves Saint Laurent était oranais.
It was in this house that Yves Saint Laurent was born in 1936, and he grew up in this district of the city. As a designer, he was heavily influenced by the colours and vibrancy of North African clothes and their features. Fashion expert Amour Gouail explains.
L'Algérie, déjà, est un pays qui possède une culture vestimentaire extraordinaire, un savoir-faire magnifique. Et tous ces éléments ont été repris et inspirés Monsieur Yves Saint Laurent lors de ses créations. On voit la présence et l'influence berbère dans ses vêtements, le Sahara, le voyage en Afrique, la femme de couleur. Il inspirait énormément.
Zaki chats to one of the locals about the famous fashion designer.
Il a grandi avec ma mère, les sœurs de ma mère. وكانوا les anciens تاع الكارتي هنايا.
Oui.
كلمات والله غالب ماشي يعرفوا l'histoire. Chaque 5 ans, 4 ans, 6 ans, يجي يضرب طله ويروح. كان يجي نوكولين تيجي avec sa canne. Cheveux gris.
Yves Saint Laurent revenait souvent ici, même plus tard après avoir quitté l'Algérie. Il revenait souvent ici pour prendre des nouvelles de ses anciens voisins et ses amis d'enfance.
Voilà.
His next tram stop is the city centre and its main square, the old Place d'Armes.
Ici, nous sommes à la place 1er novembre, la plus grande place d'Oran. Aujourd'hui, elle s'appelle la place 1er novembre, en commémoration des 1er novembre 1954, la date du déclenchement de la révolution algérienne. Mais avant, ça s'appelait la place d'Armes. On voit en haut une statue faite par les Français à l'époque de la colonisation française qui représente une victoire. Et en bas, nous avons notre victoire à nous, l'émir Abdelkader.
Abdelkader is Algeria's first nationalist hero. He held out against the French forces in western Algeria in the 1870s. His resistance paved the way for the independence movement in the 20th century. The Opera House was built in 1908 and remains a hallmark of the French colonial architecture. Zaki is feeling a little bit peckish, so he decides to head into the Medina Jadida market in the old part of town to get something to eat.
عليكم. هذا مطلع لخليك. شحال نعطيك؟ Vous connaissez ça? On appelle ça motla. C'est un pain typiquement algérien et très connu dans l'Ouest. C'est très chaud et tellement bon. L'Algérie est un pays musulman et je suis musulman, alhamdulillah. Et aujourd'hui, je vous emmène dans cette église.
This imposing building is the Sacré-Cœur Cathedral. Built in 1913. But it was the work of the Dominican bishop Pierre Claverie who transformed the layout of this immense church into something more than a local parish. He turned it into a massive public library. Bishop Claverie believed that overhauling his own cathedral into an open library would contribute to the national task of educating a growing young society, and that it would enhance friendships between Muslims and Christians and heal some of the old wounds left over by the War of Independence. Much of Oran's history has been forged by the 265-year-old war between two of its occupying powers, the Ottoman Empire and the Spanish Habsburg Empire. Both vied for control of this Mediterranean trading outpost. Their legacies are found everywhere in Oran, like these Turkish baths.
On est dans les bains turcs, dans le quartier de Sidi el-Houari. Cette salle servait de salle d'attente pour accéder au bain, et je pense avoir quelques informations sur lui. Alors selon le guide Oran,
The Turkish baths were built by the Bey of Oran, Bushilagem, in 1708, and it served as an annex to the mosque in this quarter. The Ottoman palace on the Rue Mefta Kuider is definitely worth a visit, despite needing extensive restorations.
nous sommes dans le palais du Bey. Cet espace est le symbole de la période ottomane à Oran.
Built in 1792 by the governor Mohammed el-Kabir, it gives a wondrous glimpse into the fastidious world of the 17th century Ottoman governor. He was titled the Bey, and this is commonly known as the Bey's Palace.
Le palais est justement construit au-dessus de la forteresse espagnole Ros el Khazar, sur une colline qui domine toute la ville. Et il a 3 compartiments. Diwan, le harem et le pavillon de la favorite. Pour cet espace, il y a 2 histoires. La première histoire parle de Mohammed el-Bey Kbir, le bey d'Oran, qui était un soufi et qui utilisait cette salle comme un espace de prière et de méditation et d'isolement. La deuxième histoire parle du pavillon de la favorite, c'est-à-dire parmi toutes les femmes du bey Mohammed el-Kbir, sa favorite habitait dans cette chambre. C'est très calme ici. On pouvait le voir, le bey avait une vue imprenable sur toute la ville et c'était sa façon peut-être un petit peu d'espionner les gens et de voir ce qu'ils font.
The Bey's Palace overlooks the old Spanish Quarter with its Castilian-style streets and its pretty and evocative Spanish bars. The first Spanish immigrants were Andalusian merchants who arrived here in the 10th century. They settled in this barrio. Our guide is Rashid Mahaji, who is of Spanish heritage.
Aquí estamos en el bar de Santa Cruz, que es mi bar favorito, mi cafetería. Yo siempre vengo aquí, que es un ambiente muy popular. Y es un bar también de los marineros. Yo siempre vengo aquí a tomar un café. Y nada problema. Tener un café simple. Mi nombre es Rashid Mahaji. He nacido aquí, en este barrio, en esta zona. Y es la parte española, digamos, de la ciudad de Oran. Y yo hablo español así natural. Para mí es mi segunda lengua. Yo hablo español como el árabe, ¿no? Y aquí todos son argelinos, pero es como una cultura española. Es una mezcla, para mí una mezcla, ¿no? Una mezcla entre el norte de África y la costa de España.
Spanish immigrants who arrived here in the middle of the 19th century were often unemployed labourers who had lost their jobs with the mechanisation of the Industrial Revolution. Guy Bonifacio is a descendant of Spanish Pieds Noirs, whose grandparents settled in Oran in the 1860s. His family has remained here ever since.
Mi abuelo era musicien, hacía el violón y jugaba en las fiestas, musicien professionnel de violon. Ma mère pianiste, elle jouait dans le cinéma muet. Les Espagnols assuraient la main-d'œuvre. Ils étaient cordonniers, fabriquaient des chaussures, les espadrilles, les savonneries. Le travail de la calère, c'est le four à chaud, les travaux de maçonnerie. Ils étaient en tous ces petits métiers. Mon père était tourneur sur métaux. Il est très peu allé à l'école, mais il avait un métier de qu'il avait appris en école, c'est même pour fabriquer à partir de métaux, et fabriquer des pièces de voitures, de motos. Il y avait une adresse, ils étaient pêcheurs. Le port, c'était espagnol.
The environment of Oran at least offered a semblance of familiarity to the expat Spaniards. Maravillas Puertas moved to Oran because the city reminded her of home.
Llamo Maravillas, soy profesora de español. Estamos actualmente en una de las plazas de Sidi el Juari, una placeta. Hay muchas en todo el barrio, más pequeñitas, más recoletas. Esta es la de la Perla. Actualmente había una zona de baños públicos que luego más tarde cubrieron y que explica un poco el tipo de vida que llevaban aquí los españoles exiliados, que era pues como la de España, ¿no? Placetas para reunirse, tomar el fresco por la noche, charlar. Una zona muy viva, con muchos niños, mucha gente, muchos mercados. Para los franceses había los argelinos en lo más bajo, a continuación los españoles y luego estaban ellos. Entonces eso explica que los españoles vivieran en este barrio humilde, donde las construcciones no son de lujos, son populares y por eso están un poco más deterioradas que las de la zona francesa.
Algeria's most famous adopted son was the writer Albert Camus. Born of a Spanish mother and a French father, Camus grew up in Algiers. It was here in Oran, when he first worked as a school teacher, that he developed his existential philosophy, born out of the struggles of the natives in the face of colonial rule. He wrote one of his famous works, The Plague, here in Oran. The Spanish influence in Oran extends to the local cuisine. Let's return to our guide, Zaki.
Et je vais vous faire découvrir le repas le plus populaire de la ville d'Oran, mais aussi le moins cher, la kalentika.
This is Spanish peasant food.
Toujours aussi bon, parfait. La kalentika, en fait, est un plat espagnol, à la base. La légende dit qu'il a été inventé dans le fort de Santa Cruz, à l'époque espagnole. Donc il y avait les militaires espagnols, il y avait une pénurie de repas. Le cuisinier du fort n'avait que du pois chiche. Donc il a inventé ce repas à base de pois chiche et il a fait attendre les gens les militaires pendant des heures et des heures et des heures. Et la légende dit que plus les militaires s'impatientaient pour manger et plus il leur disait qu'il faut attendre parce qu'ils se mangent chaud. Donc il disait caliente, caliente. Et le nom, à la base, c'est caliente, qui est devenu kalentika à Oran.
Fort Santa Cruz on the summit of Mount Mordajo. It's 400 meters above the sea. An Ottoman fort constructed in 1577 and modified by Spain, which took over Oran nearly 30 years later, and which they held for another 300 years.
And they grow all around the castle.
Zaki meets restoration architect Radia Bourbia.
So there's an old saying about Oran stating that the Spanish exchanged mountains of gold for mountains of rocks. They were really determined to take over Oran, and they built a whole system of fortifications. For example, this one. It's shaped like a star.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, it has pointy ends to prevent direct hits of cannons. And this castle looks over other castles underneath.
Zaki inspects the defences, a portcullis with loopholes above it, from where hot burning oil would be poured on the invading Ottomans. There are also subterranean tunnels linking the fort to other forts in the city. Zaki also looks at the rainwater storage system, reaching down to a reservoir, which allowed the soldiers to survive inside the fort for months during an Ottoman siege. The officers' garrison was high up in the main castle. Visit it today and enjoy the great views down to the city. It's the perfect place to keep an eye on an approaching enemy.
Le soleil se couche, c'est déjà la fin de notre journée. J'espère que vous avez aimé ce que vous avez vu. En tout cas, j'ai essayé de vous montrer un petit bout de ce qui est mon Oran. Si vous voulez voir Oran en entier, il faut venir ici, croyez-moi, ça en vaut le détour. Salam. Ah, mais il reste une dernière chose à faire. Vous ne pouvez pas venir à Oran sans goûter à la Méditerranée.
Our next destination is the ancient Algerian capital of Tlemcen. It's a 1-hour drive through the rolling hills of the coastal hinterland to get to this most historic of Algerian cities. It means spring in Berber, a busy agricultural town of medieval splendour, capped by a 14th century Moorish-style mosque and minaret. This was once a royal city, and even today the locals speak in a different dialect than other Berber tribes in Algeria.
Oh, for others Algerian who don't speak this accent, for him it's very exciting. It's very symbolic accent. When they hear the Tlemcenian speak, it's a symbol of beauty, of civilization, of raffinity of Tlemcen and the history of Tlemcen.
Tlemcen was once the most significant city in Algeria.
Tlemcen was the capital of the Maghreb, central Maghreb, I mean Algeria, because at that time Algeria was called the Central Maghreb, Morocco is the Maghreb, and Tunisia was Africa. Tlemcen was the capital of the country. All the commerce between Africa and Europe passed through Tlemcen. It was like a transit.
As the commercial fulcrum of Algeria, Tlemcen became a target for the competing Islamic dynasties in North Africa in the Middle Ages. It was the Zaynids who turned Tlemcen into a sumptuous royal kingdom.
When the Zaynids established their dynasty, they built the castle or the palace of El-Meshwar.
El-Meshwar Palace remains a gem of Zaynid achievement. The name literally means the place of Meshwara, translated as the place of advisory councils. It was as much a complex building set within an impressively walled citadel where ministers gathered, as it was the royal residence for the Zaynid ruler Yagmarasan, who made this his home in the early 14th century. The king's palace is at the heart of the citadel, and it's most certainly worth a visit. It was one of 4, and this one is the actual king's residence, a fountain garden of paradise leading to the Diwan, the king's council, and harem above. It also has suites on either side, assigned to the seasons of winter and summer. The winter suite is built of stone, and the summer one is constructed with marble to keep the rooms cool. The building has an Andalusian style of Islamic architecture, wrapped in Quranic inscriptions, largely restored from the foundations that have survived wars and uprisings. Original slabs can be seen in the stonework to reference the reconstruction. Most peculiar, however, are several long white tunnels. One is the king's personal exit to the mosque, but the other was his escape route. When the city was besieged by the Marinid enemy who descended on Tlemcen at the end of the 13th century, it was thought that the citadel was impregnable, especially with its thick defensive walls, which have survived the test of time.
At 1299, the Marinids king Abu Yaqub al-Mansur came here to dominate the city of Tlemcen, and he came here in this place which was out of the city and built a military camp to control the city and to attack, of course, to attack the city, to dominate it.
This is El Mansoura, the remains of Yaqub's military camp, from which he hoped to conquer the walled city of Tlemcen. A minaret overlooks the enemy so soldiers could keep a lookout.
The minaret of Al Mansoura is a very particular one. Why? Because it was built very high. It used to have 45 meters of height, and it was built in purpose to have the chance for the king to watch all what is happening in the city. The minaret of Al Mansoura had a very beautiful decoration and ornamentation, different colored columns, so that every color represents something which has a relationship with Islam.
Yaqub was hoping for a swift victory, but the siege became a long battle which required the building of this huge citadel.
After building these two edifices, the Mansoura became a big city surrounded by a great wall, and this great wall had 88 towers.
This was followed by a great mosque, which once stood on this expansive courtyard. And in the same way that a Christian cathedral denotes the city, so a mosque turns a citadel into a city too. Entering the mosque was rather unconventional.
The particularity of this minaret is that you can find the principal door of the mosque in the minaret. In an ordinary mosque, you can find the minaret and the door is apart. So that the minaret is Al Mansoura is at the same time the principal entry of the mosque. It was a large city, of course. They built it to live here in Tlemcen. In fact, at that time, we have two different cities. The first one is Al Mansoura, surrounded by its wall, and the second one is the original city of Tlemcen, is Al Mashwar, surrounded by a great wall until the city of Agadir.
Calling his citadel the Victorious was a presumption, for Yaqub Mansour could not blow the Tlemcen wall down, no matter how hard he tried. He abandoned his mission in 1307.
The siege stayed for 8 years, trying and trying to enter the city of Tlemcen, to control or to dominate the city of Tlemcen, and they didn't succeed. After 8 years of trying, they returned to their country, to Morocco.
We leave Tlemcen and head across the Orez Mountains to eastern Algeria, where we explore Roman Timgad in the province of Batna. This is one of the least developed areas of Algeria. Consequently, it has some of the most stunning scenery in the country. It is not surprising that this region was once the domain of those Berber kings of yore, the Numidians. Their tombs dominate the Batna countryside. This once powerful Algerian realm existed almost 2,000 years before French occupation ignited the fires of independence. In the plains of Batna, along the foothills of the Orez mountain range, there's also a Roman settlement, so well preserved that it's called Algeria's Pompeii. It is the city of Timgad, and it's a must-see for any intrepid traveller. It's one of Algeria's archaeological jewels. Timgad was built by the great Roman Emperor Trajan in 100 AD as an encampment for his Roman soldiers of the 3rd Augustan Legion.
Thereafter, the area flourished because of the high productivity of these high plateaus for wheat production. And the wheat of North Africa, and later its olive oil, were major economic resources for the area.
The town is famously signposted by a great triumphal arch, and every visitor to the settlement had to choose which god to please. Local archaeologist Kader Ben Salah knows this site well.
On a deux inscriptions importantes, donc qui sont encore sur place in situ, où on a l'inscription dédiée à l'acte Concordia et l'autre au dieu Mars, donc au dieu de la guerre. Et c'est comme si, quelque part, on voulait dire que si vous voulez venir dans cette ville avec la paix, vous serez les bienvenus. Mais par contre, si vous venez avec des idées belliqueuses, vous aurez donc ce qui vous attendra, vous saurez ce qui vous attendra.
Once inside the main carriageway, you can truly behold this breathtaking settlement on what is a supreme example of Roman urban planning. Timgad is a perfect square consisting of 111 blocks comprising of houses and public buildings. The town is bisected by two main streets set perpendicular to each other.
Cette ville a été construite selon un plan typiquement romain, c'est-à-dire deux voies principales qui est le decumanus maximus et le cardo maximus, qui sont les axes des 4 points cardinaux. Donc ils font le nord-sud pour le cardo maximus et l'est-ouest pour le decumanus maximus. Alors, les deux voies se rencontraient au niveau du forum, qui est la place centrale de la ville et où c'est le cœur battant de la ville, où on a une basilique judiciaire, une curie et aussi le Capitole.
The Forum was the centre of all Roman public life. This was both the place for social gathering and for selling goods. It had a temple dedicated to the Emperor Trajan and his military victories. Then there is the Capitol. This towering temple is dedicated to the gods Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. There are 14 Roman baths in Timgad. They would have been used by weary travellers entering the settlement. There's also the amphitheatre. It's built into the side of a hill and is comparatively smaller than other Roman theatres, but it could still seat 3,500 spectators on a good day.
The interesting thing about Timgad is, although it is a spectacular site, it's a spectacular site with a history that's largely unknown. Its historical references are few. By and large, Timgad was forgotten in Roman history, but of course it's come alive through the magnificent ruins that we have today. Timgad appears to have been destroyed sometime in the 5th century by Moorish brigands, and when the Byzantines conquered North Africa in 533, they arrived at Timgad to find the city deserted. The site was covered with sand and forgotten until it was excavated during the early part of the French occupation of Algeria.
Our next destination is Bajaya. It's a scenic 3-hour drive through fantastic scenery in a region known as Kabyle. Its hills form part of a mountainous belt that stretches west to Morocco's Atlas Mountains and east to the Aures Mountains bordering Tunisia. The capital of Kabyle is the port of Bajaya, and the coast around this industrial city bears some impressive coastline. This land has had a special significance for Berbers for centuries, most recently like poets such as Hassan Mahmed.
إلي ذوين ورنقان ورنسقان ضقت ذق زال ذي ما يوكي أكرفدنت لمواجي سنيقو فلا أكتيرنت لمواجي وقيق وقارنت وقاق أكغزنت لمواجي لقاي وقارنت لقاي إلي ذوين ورنسقال ورنحنس يشفون وريستو ذو الميسن ثو الدرس أكرفدنت لمواجي ندان وندن نيطان نيت اللين وزكاز والسايق النكرن.
Kabyle is a Berber heartland. The Berbers are the indigenous people of North Africa who were here centuries before the Arabs arrived in the mid-7th century. Berbers are famed for their craft skills, like pottery and carpet making. Although Arab influence has heavily inspired Berber dress codes, women's clothes in particular exude ancient origins. They have always been vibrant and decorative, with outfits embellished with jewellery and decorations, motifs and insignia. Each Berber region, such as Kabyle, has its own traditional costumes. Alia Asio Hoji is a Kabyle seamstress who is using these traditions in the outfits she's making today.
Là, je veux présenter des robes traditionnelles. Par exemple, ici, tu trouves le vert, tu trouves le blanc et le noir.
The Berber colours and distinctive braid decorations.
Mais là, j'ai modifié, je le fais avec un galant. J'ai un motif de la clé de Hogar. Il ressemble un petit peu à la clé de Hogar. Avec, en même temps, c'est un motif kabyle.
Folk here speak a Berber dialect, Kabyle. And although Tamazight, as it is commonly known, is a dying language, it's still taught passionately in schools. The Berber Tamazight language was first given an official status in Algeria in 2002, a year after the bloody riots that left more than 100 people dead in Kabyle. In 2016, it became enshrined in the constitution as a state language alongside Arabic. The Director of Education, Badra Brahim, explains the importance of language to one's sense of identity.
Aujourd'hui, à l'ère de la mondialisation, du développement technologique, le monde est un village. Donc il ne sert à rien de cacher son identité ou de la dissimuler. Donc il vaut mieux aller droit au but et rattraper le retard qu'on a déjà perdu, surtout concernant l'identité de la personne. Donc là, aller droit au but, notamment dans le système scolaire, c'est commencer l'enseignement, la scolarisation de l'enfant par la langue maternelle, c'est déjà un grand pas. C'est déjà un grand pas parce que chez nous, malheureusement, l'élève, aussi bien qu'il soit dans la région berbérophone ou arabophone, il commence la scolarisation par une langue étrangère à lui.
Our final journey takes us to historic Constantine. Its unique geography has it sitting on a rocky outcrop connected by 8 bridges. It's a busy city with a population of almost 500,000 people and a complicated one-way road system to navigate the gorge. It's also an historic and traditional place, a city of quaint souks serving local delicacies and food such as this, black couscous. It's called mizyet. Local restaurateur Benashir Bey explains more about Constantine's signature dish.
Le couscous noir, c'est un couscous qui est typiquement constantinois et notamment c'est la façon de cuisiner, on peut le trouver dans d'autres régions, mais la façon de le cuisiner à Constantine est un peu spéciale. C'est un couscous qu'on a hérité, cet art culinaire à travers nos ancêtres et on est très fiers de transmettre de génération en génération cet art culinaire. Et le couscous, il est fait en fait à base du blé. Et qu'on le met retendre pendant un bon bout de temps, jusqu'à ce qu'il aboutisse vers cette couleur qui est assez noire.
Mizyet, black couscous, is prepared with barley. The barley is fermented in pits dug underground and left for up to 2 years. It's symbolic of the culinary heritage of Constantine and its surrounding region. The mizyet is usually served with a spicy meat stew and chickpeas, cooked with local spices.
On peut trouver ce couscous noir dans d'autres régions, mais pour retrouver ce goût-là, il faut venir à Constantine et visiter notre belle ville qui est Constantine.
The Abdelkader Mosque is the oldest in the city. It's what the locals call their Taj Mahal. Built in the 13th century on the site of a pagan temple, it was intended to hold most of Constantine's population. Although it has been rebuilt over the centuries and has a modern facade, the interior still retains some of its original features. The monumental mosque seeks to make a powerful Islamic statement. Possibly because Constantine, before the coming of Islam, was Roman Christianity's first Algerian city. It was named after its pious emperor of the same name. The Phoenicians called it Sirta. In fact, Constantine has always been at the centre of Algeria's political and cultural life. The Sirta Museum in the Old Town Hall offers up an eclectic display of statues, friezes and tombstones. The museum's director, Dr. Amel Soltani, tells us more.
La spécificité de ce musée, c'est que c'est un musée qui raconte toute l'histoire de l'Algérie.
The Constantine story begins with these Phoenician tombstones found in the region, commemorating pagan deities like the fertility god Baal. Phoenician traders then gave way to the Carthaginians who founded the city of Sirta. It then became the capital of the Kingdom of Numidia until it was annexed by Rome in 46 BC. Roman Constantine, the city, was once gloriously decorated with fountains. This is a surviving sculpture of the Greek god Dionysus, or the Roman one, Bacchus, the god of agriculture, fertility, and wine. But the presiding exhibits are the Roman mosaics.
Les mosaïques, en général, on peut les trouver ou dans des maisons de riches, de maîtres, de bourgeois, ou dans les thermes romains.
These mosaic floors would be found in homes and in the baths of the Roman upper classes who lived here. They depict scenes of naval fights and swimmers. In them, you can see a skillful geometry in the typography, a refined aesthetic in art that Romans had developed by the 2nd century. Constantine was eventually sacked by Vandals in the 5th century. Algeria's Roman ruins are exquisite. Just outside Constantine is another spectacular site, Jamila. Originally built for Roman soldiers, it's another UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it sits in a spectacular setting. Its remaining centerpiece is the monumental arch of Caracalla. Its relics include forums, temples, basilicas, arches, streets and houses. Jamila remains one of the most impressive examples of how the Romans adapted their architecture to mountainous locations. It is situated on a hilltop surrounded by hills of the Atlas mountain ranges at an altitude of 3,000 feet. A 1,000 years later, the Ottomans occupied Algeria, and 3 centuries after that, the Ottoman governor El-Hajj Ahmed Bey built this exquisite Ottoman palace. The palace has a harem overlooking a series of courtyards ringed by tiled arcades. It's a beautiful Islamic depiction of paradise and is one of the best restored palaces of its kind in all of Algeria. Local guide Rouag Meidine tells us more.
Pour l'architecture du palais, il y a un mélange entre le style mauresque, c'est toujours, il y a 2 jardins à l'intérieur. Le premier jardin, c'est le jardin des orangers et le jardin des palmiers. Le style mauresque, c'est toujours les jardins à l'intérieur. Comme la Rambla, Sevilla, Cordoba, c'est toujours, il y a un jardin à l'intérieur.
The timing of the palace's construction couldn't have been worse. It coincided with the French siege of Algiers. As French troops moved eastwards, Ahmed Bey defended the city with zeal, but he was overwhelmed. He fled the palace after living in it for only 2 years. He did not surrender until 1848, the same year Abdelkader gave up the fight against France in the west. After independence, the Algerian army turned the palace into their military headquarters. Constantine's history, like much of Algeria, is a story of conquests, battles, and occupations. This grand monument overlooking Constantine actually commemorates French soldiers who lost their lives in World War I battles in faraway Europe. But it's a great place to view Constantine today. And beyond it, the rolling hills of a rich and vibrant coastal hinterland. It's a richness which surprises those who visit this Africa's largest country.
PBS America tells the story of a dynamic man with unyielding principles who overcame incredible odds to escape from slavery. He was the inspiration behind the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. We profile Joshua Henson in Redeeming Uncle Tom next.